which was really a result of many thought-provoking discussions that we had over the semester at the Symposium Institute, and on a topic that is both challenging and exciting, and we thought it would be great to involve more people in this discussion. Many studies have shown that algorithms shaping our lives can have certain unintended consequences. They can unfairly or disproportionately affect different sections of the population based on their race, gender, or socioeconomic status. There have been many examples like algorithms like Compass, which predict that black defendants have a higher risk of reoffending compared to white defendants with the same background, or delivery systems that charge higher to deliver in certain regions inadvertently discriminate against minority neighborhoods. Or women were, a 2015 study showed that women were shown significantly lower paying job postings compared to men. Natural language processing models have shown that there's already a lot of stereotypes that are captured in these models, such as associations with the word women and receptionist, and the list really goes on. So for all of for all of us who are in optimization, it's no brainstormer that these issues can arise in any optimization method, especially for the methods that are data-driven, because data itself incorporates a lot of the social context it was generated in. And even then, a lot of this the study of unintended consequences is largely missing from our thought process while designing optimization methods, and it's urgent that we spend some brain cycles on it. And with the symposium, we hope to facilitate this discussion and hopefully together, collectively as a research community, come up with ideas and concrete reactions that at the Symons Institute. Christoph has authored 15 popular science books, including one which has a German title that I dare not pronounce here, but it says Algorithms Shaping Our Daily Lives. And Christoph is going to talk to us about, is bias a social or a mathematical concept?
Yeah, thank you, Swati. Okay, I'm not a scientist. I'm more here to ask questions than to answer them, and I hope that we get a lot of insight from the two other talks. My talk has a little bit of very simple and primitive math in it, and so excuse me if it's all too superficial, but you're the scientist, I'm just the journalist. So I want to start out, so the question is bias a social or a mathematical concept? Can we mathematically formulate what bias is, and what kind of bias do we accept, and what kind of bias don't we accept? So I just construed a simple example. We have a community, we're looking for drug dealers, right? And we have a community that has only two kinds of cars, a Prius and a Corvette. And from experience, we know that we have a lot of Priuses and a very small fraction of it, and we have fewer Corvettes. And just a small fraction of the Priuses belongs to drug dealers, like 100 of these 1,400. So a 1 in a 14 chance of finding drugs in a Prius. And we know that drug dealers love Corvettes, and so of these 600 Corvettes, we can expect like half of them having drugs in them. So now we're putting up a police post and we're checking cars, and we're stopping cars, and in order to find the bad guys. And the question is, first of all, what's the best method to be effective? And of course, the first approach is we check randomly, right? We can pick 200 cars. That's my assumption. So 10% of the cars we can check on that checkpoint in the road. We can check them randomly as they come by, and so we check 140 of the Priuses, and we check 60 of the Corvettes, and then we can. The chance for each of the bad guys to be caught is 1 in 10. And how many guys are we catching? Well, 40 bad guys, 10 in the Priuses, and 30 in the Corvettes. That's a simple math example. But now one police officer has a great idea and says, hey, we want to catch more of them, so why don't we just ignore the Priuses and just check the Corvettes? And that would be a great success. So I check only the red cars, 200 of them, and 0 Priuses. And so all the bad guys in the Priuses come away with their drugs. They're not caught. The bad guys in the Corvettes are caught with a chance of 1 in 3. And so I catch 100 bad guys. That's a lot more. But is this fair? Am I biased? What am I biased against? Well, one argument is, well, those bad guys on the left, they don't have a chance to be caught at all. So I'm thinking of a third approach. And I'm looking at the 400 bad guys that I have in this population. And they're distributed 1 to 3. So a quarter drives a Prius, and 3/4 drive a Corvette. And so I'm saying the cars I check them in the proportion of this occurrence of bad people. So if I have 200 to check, I can check 50 of the Priuses and 150 of the Corvettes. And I go ahead with that, and now I catch some of the Priuses, 4 of them, and 75 of the Corvettes. So to sum up my three strategies, this is the risk of a Prius guy to be caught, bad Prius to be caught, bad Corvette to be caught, and the overall risk. And these are the numbers. So which one is the best method? What do you think? Any opinions? I don't really have an opinion here. I'm just asking the question. So from a mathematical or from a legal standpoint, what's the best way to check for cars? I mean, in practice, I think police people have an idea of, how a car looks that might belong to a drug dealer. They have prejudice. It might even be founded in data. But can they turn this into practice, or do they have to apply the totally random method? On purpose, I don't include race or gender or anything in this that might sound like bias. That's not allowed. But yeah, how do you proceed here? And this has been a discussion in New York in those stop and frisk discussions. Can I just stop people and check them based on how they look? And there, of course, race and stuff comes into play. So what's fair? I don't know. Let me go back to the source of this, or one of the sources of this discussion is the discussion about disparate impact. In the US, this was a decision in 1971. A company was hiring, I don't even remember what kind of a job it was, but they checked for if the people had a high school diploma or it did an IQ test with them. And of course, they couldn't base their decision openly on race or gender or these things, but they based it on those tests. And then the court said, no, you can't do that either, because it's an indirect way of judging people by their race or their economic background, because people with a certain background don't have a high school diploma that often, or do worse on an IQ test. And it said the reason is the requirements were unlawful unless shown to be job related. And so the question is, what's job related here? There are, I did a quick search, it's very controversial if an IQ is a predictor for how you perform in your job. I think it depends on the job. For some jobs, people say it's a good predictor, for others not. But in the age of big data, so this court was obviously talking about something that could be shown to be related to the job. So for example, if you hire for construction workers who have to pick up heavy loads, it's not discriminating if you don't hire a woman or a weak man that can't lift those loads. That's job related. But no?
I think there was also a case for firefighting that where women sued, because they only hired men, and it was the job description actually does not require so much of a physical strength.
Well, then you can check if it's really true that they.
Test the physical strength instead of just.
It could have been an argument by the employer to say, oh, we always have to lift these heavy loads, and in fact they didn't, right? Just to protect their practice. But if we look at big data algorithms, they don't look for obvious connections. They look for the most absurd connections, and they especially don't look for causality, what it has to do with each other. In the first order, they just look at correlations between data. There was an example of a company hiring programmers, and they found that all the good programmers went to a certain Japanese manga website and were, like these Japanese comics. And it obviously has nothing to do with the job, but well, what the hell, right? If you find the people there, and the good programmers go to that website, and you look in their resumes and what their hobbies are, then why not? So, but this has had a lot of consequences, and there are certain classes that are protected, and they're race, color, religion, national origin, sex, sometimes disability status, and age, which you can't use in decisions about loans or jobs or whatever, and not even you can't even discriminate obviously, but it's also forbidden to discriminate like indirectly through a parameter that is somehow related to these. And of course, the purpose of these big data algorithms is always to discriminate, right? You want to pick the good candidates and separate them from the bad candidates. And the software per se doesn't know these categories. It doesn't know the indirect relationships. And it tends to give you a sample that it discriminates as being the best candidates for a certain job. And then you have to go back and find and see if there's any discrimination against those classes. And since the question in the beginning was, is it a social construction or a mathematical? Well, in the first place, it's a social one, because these are the categories we pick that shouldn't be discriminated against, and that's not in the math. So it's about correlation and not causation if we look at big data algorithms. And here's two more examples. A company that does these job applications found out that the distance from work, so the closer someone lives to their workplace, the more they're engaged in their job and the longer they stay in their job, which you can think about why this could be the case. You think, oh yeah, I have to commute so much, I'm just stay in this job until I find something better. And so they offered this to companies in their package deal to pick their candidates. But then a company like Xerox came to the conclusion, no, we don't want that, because if you just take the example of San Francisco, you have a job that is downtown San Francisco, then the people who have a shorter commute tend to be the ones who can afford to live in San Francisco, and the people with the longer commute live in poorer neighborhoods. I don't know where the nearest poor neighborhood is when you go from the center of San Francisco, but there have been stories recently about people who commute 2 hours to work to do a like housekeeping or janitor job in San Francisco, and then go back to that neighborhood that they can afford to live in. So clearly that would discriminate against certain social groups. I read an article, so the company, Evolve is the name of the company that does these algorithms, and they've seen that it's a problem, but they're ambiguous about it. I don't know which of their customers use that or not. And another thing is moving frequency. So people who move a lot, they tend not to stay in their job for so long, which sounds trivial at the first glance, because yeah, they're moving, so they're changing jobs. But here the question is, what's the cause and what's the result, right? So they might be sloppy in their jobs, then they leave and they take another one and move, or they have to move because they lose their jobs often because the job isn't well paid, And so maybe it's better to make them happier at their job, and then they won't move that much. So as I said, these algorithms look for correlations, not for causation. And it's known that people with a lower social status move more often than others, and one reason is that they tend to lose their jobs more often. There was this, I hope I don't bore you with this example, it's been reported on, that for an unintended consequence, the city of Boston had this program called Street Bump, where they made a cell phone app that you have in your car, and the accelerometer recognizes, when you're going over a pothole, and it immediately sends the data to the city, and the city has a map, and then it registers where all the potholes are, and can improve the infrastructure, come back and fix the potholes. But then people found out that, well, especially at this time, I think now everybody has a cell phone, even in poor neighborhoods. But for example, the tendency to download an app and use it in your car was higher in affluent neighborhoods. And so what happened that the streets, or what could happen is that it's a reinforcing effect, that the potholes in the well-off neighborhoods get fixed more often. And so the streets are even better than in poor neighborhoods. And the city of Boston recognized this. They're working on it, and I don't think this is a permanent problem. But this is the sign of a very unintended consequence of an algorithm that none of the developers had even thought of. Right? They thought, okay, people have cell phone, and it's great, and we can improve life for everybody. But it's not fair in the sense that certain social groups are at a disadvantage. So then the courts in the U.S. looked at this and said, well, when is a certain selection fair and when is it unfair? And it came to this 80% rule. And I have an example for that. So let's assume we have a job with 60, we have 10 jobs in a company and 100 people apply for these 10 jobs. They're kind of the same kind of job. And we have to pick 10 people out of the 100, and there were 60 men applying and 40 women. And we just start hiring, and we look at their resumes and pick them out, and we get 7 men and 3 women. Is that fair, or do we discriminate against them? Obviously, the proportion of women is even smaller than in the applications. And this 80% rule goes like this. We take the acceptance rate of the men, which is 11.7% here, 7 out of 60, and 3 out of 40 women is 7.5%. And then we look at the relation of these two numbers. So, and we find that 7.5 over 11.7 is 64%. So this acceptance rate is only 64% of that. And the rule is if it's under 80%, it's unfair, and these women could go to court and say, I was treated unfairly. It's not, they don't use it consistently. It's a very big legal system, so, but it's often been applied, this rule. So what can we do here? For example, we say, oh yeah, we hire 5 women and 5 men. And then if you take the numbers like that, you find out that you're discriminating against the men because they are below the 80%. So in this numeric example, the only thing you can do is hire 6 men and 4 women. Everything else would be discriminatory.
The rule only across men and women, or does it apply to other categories?
It applies to all categories. So you can do black and white. You can do, and there have been court. The courts have decided about that. Yeah.
You mentioned earlier about protected classes and how we're not allowed to collect data about certain things. But if you were to have some kind of fair classification algorithm, but that requires that protected label in order to ensure the fairness, what are the legal ramifications of that? Because it seems like
I think that's our big topic here, right? I mean, that's what we're going to discuss all day. So No, what's the question exactly?
So, I mean, just if we want to do something about this and we want to design classification algorithms that are fair, those algorithms would need the protected labels, the information about whether someone is a man or a woman or black or white
Yeah.
or whatever. But currently, employers or banks or whatever aren't even allowed to have that data.
Okay.
It seems like there's like a legal step.
I don't know if they're not allowed to have it or not to use it. Right? That's a difference, right? Yeah.
I mean, ultimately, you have to have and use it, right? So.
Well, that's okay. So we're going to come back to that probably later when we ask how can we test an algorithm for its fairness, right? Basically, you can even if you don't know the algorithm, you can treat it as a black box and see what happens if you put in a certain parameters and what comes out, and does it have that effect, right? But it's very tricky. Everything is very tricky here. So I do some more math with this example. This came out last year. This is about a software that was applied to predict whether people in jail get probation, so are released early based on the likelihood that they would reoffend and commit a crime again. And ProPublica did a big study on that. This is a study done in Florida with 10,000 inmates, and they came to the conclusion that this was racially biased. And they gave examples in the story that, you know, a black woman who had never had a lot of offenses, shoplifted, got in jail and got a very bad score on this by this algorithm, and a white defendant who had, you know, a long register of prior crimes, he got a very low risk. So they looked into the numbers, and I'll show you the numbers here because I went a little deeper and looked how did they determine that. So the first thing we get is if you look at the black inmates and the white inmates, so they get like almost 60% are classified as high risk, and with the white guys it's only 35%. Is this racial bias? We don't know yet because we don't know what happens afterwards, right? If they get released, is it justified to assign this high risk to them? So you look at these numbers. Oh yeah, we can look horizontally. Survived means that so we look after 2 years, what happened to these people. Survived means they didn't commit another crime. That's the terminology they use. Recidivated, this means they did commit another crime. And so with the black inmates, it was like half and half, and here it was 60-40. So the number of whites who committed another crime was a lot smaller than the blacks. So you might say, is it biased? Maybe not. Maybe they had the black guys were the more nasty guys, the more evil guys that they had in this sample. And you can look at split this up by low risk and high risk. And what you see is, well, these are big numbers, so I did percentages too. So you see that in the black community, 65% of the low risk, people who are classified low risk, really didn't commit a crime, so correctly. 35% did, but it was pretty similar here. And if you look at the high risk people, like a third of them did not commit a crime, although they were classified as high risk, and 2/3 actually did commit another crime. And it's kind of similar here. So so where's the discrimination? Where's the racial bias? Yeah?
I was going to say, I feel like it's worth noting that, you know, we don't actually know whether they committed a crime per se. We know whether they were arrested. And so, there's another layer, which is that even these so-called ground truth numbers are already being sort of affected by a layer that's happening kind of before this.
Let's point out one other issue, right, which is that if somebody is not given probation but sentenced, and they wouldn't have committed another crime, that's not something we're going to know either, right? It's another form of censored data.
Yeah. But that's the fine print. There's something more obvious here. I go back to the to the numbers, and now I look at the row. I don't look at the columns, but I look at the rows. And if I look at the survivors, so the ones that that didn't commit a crime in those 2 years, and I look at the percentages now in those rows, I see that especially if you look at the false positives, so the people who didn't get parole, were kept longer in jail but didn't commit a crime. We have 45% here, and we have only 23% here. So the false positives are a lot higher in the black group. And if you look at the false negatives, that's the people who were considered low risk and released and did commit a crime, then this number is very high with the white guys. So if you look at the numbers like this, you see that the white people got a lot better, you know, their prognosis was better than in effect the reality. So that's where the bias and the discrimination can hide, even if you know, you look at the data another way, it looks pretty fair. And the last thing I did, I went back to my car example, and the third method I had for the Priuses and the Corvettes, and found, of course, if you look at the false positives and the false negatives here, then you get a result that a lot more of the Prius people, the not obvious drug offenders, get away, and here you have a rate of 25% of people who are being checked and searched and have nothing to hide. So yeah, that was my little math excursion. But I come back to the question, and so I can pull up an example with cars, which is not a protected item, and probably most people would say it's fair to look at a car and then decide whether you want to check it or not, and be biased against certain types of cars, because you have to discriminate if you're a good cop, you have to, you know, find clues. And if it's the color of our skin or our sex or whatever, we all decided that we don't want to discriminate against that. And so in this way, if you see it like that, bias, of course, is a social construction, and that doesn't mean we shouldn't use these, but it's something we decide as a society that we don't want to be biased against. And so that's the end of my talk. Thank you. Any questions for now?
So how many of us think that bias is a social concept? How many think it's a mathematical concept?
Yeah, and of course I want to hear more about the math of it, right? That's why we have the other talk.
With that, let's invite our next speaker.
Maybe we
We
should
have some time. We have like
take
10
a-
minutes.
let's take a short
Okay.
break. There's coffee and treats
Okay.
outside. And
Oh, great.
Let me keep right on the schedule. If people were going to show up for this talk at 9:45.
All right.
Not,